Former President Donald Trump is upping the attacks on Vice President Kamala Harris. Trump, holding an hour-long press conference, went after Harris's intelligence and criticized her failure to field questions from journalists or sit down for a formal interview. Harris's campaign is trying to portray the event as a public meltdown, her team effectively turning the race upside down in less than 3 weeks, with a surge in energy on the Democratic ticket. Both Harris and Trump have agreed to face off in at least one debate, now on the schedule for next month on September 10th.
I look forward to the debates because I think we have to set the record straight.
Glad that he's finally agreed to a debate on September 10th. I'm looking forward to it and hope he shows up.
Here to break down the latest campaign headlines, The Hill's Cate Martel. Let's go ahead and jump to this Mar-a-Lago event. Trump really attempting to cut short Harris's honeymoon period by speaking to reporters yesterday. He mainly went after Harris personally and questioned her intelligence multiple times. Kate, what did Trump accomplish by holding this presser?
Wild press conference that reminds me of, his 2016 and 2020 press conferences that would often go on for an hour or even 2 hours. And what Trump materially accomplished is there's a debate on the books, like you mentioned, for September 10th. He actually called for 2 more debates. There'd be 3 in total. And the other material thing that Trump accomplished is he got Vice President Harris to agree to do a media sit-down interview. The details haven't been worked out, but she did tell reporters later on that her team is going to get something on the books, hopefully by the end of the month. So materially, he had a few accomplishments. That being said, I think what he really accomplished is showing how much Kamala Harris is getting under his skin and irking him. It was so prevalent in the whole interview, how much he is frustrated by her momentum. She's only been a candidate for less than 3 weeks now, which sounds crazy to say. It feels like it's been forever. And in the past 3 weeks, she's not only had the headlines of Democrats coalescing around her without any type of, contested primary, but she's also, had the Veep stakes headlines of speculating who would end up being her running mate. And now she's having, big crowds at her rallies that she's having with the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz. So overall, I just saw Trump rattled and irked by Kamala Harris's momentum and surge. And yes, Republicans are calling it this honeymoon period that could very well come to an end. But I think we saw on display is a very frustrated former president who's trying to take back attention in the headlines.
Trump has continued to follow his campaign game plan, attack at all costs. But now with Democrats focused on the future, are Republicans starting to feel worn out over Trump's messaging? He's really recycling that same strategy that you mentioned he's had in 2016 and 2020.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that, there is this compelling contrast between the 2 campaigns. Now, former President Trump has run in 2 presidential campaigns before now, and his message is very familiar with people, whether they love him or they hate him. People know his message. And, I've really seen the Harris-Walz campaign, even this week, lean into this contrast. They're talking about bringing the joy back into the process. And I think that can potentially be an effective argument to a lot of voters who were really sick of the Trump-Biden back and forth. That was not a new campaign for them and something that I think that a lot of voters kind of got tired of. So it's fascinating for me to see how this new message is coming out. And I think that some Republicans are, sick of some of this message. And that's why, I think we're seeing some of the polls start to switch around and start to level out. And we're seeing a very close race because I think that, Republicans did have their Republican presidential primary this season, but Trump went in it basically already the nominee. He was the presumptive nominee even before, we even saw Iowa or New Hampshire vote. So I do think there is some frustration among, some Republicans having the same message. And it is a fascinating contrast compared to the Democratic side.
Trump and Harris will hit the campaign trail today after both agreeing to debate for the first time on September 10th. Kate, what do you know about Harris as a debater? How might her matchup with Trump be different than debates with Biden and Trump?
I'm so fascinated to see this debate between Harris and Trump. Trump, we know him as a debater. He has the same strategy that he's been going after since he's been on the political stage. Now, Harris, she's a former prosecutor. She's a great debater. And I think it's going to be a very different dynamic than when Trump was debating President Biden. President Biden, didn't have the attacks that I think Harris could potentially have, that I think she could have a pretty effective debate. That being said, at the same time, she was part of and still is part of the Biden administration, and she does have Biden's record that she has to defend. So depending on how Trump can phrase the economy and the border and whether he can put her on defense, that could change the dynamic of the debate, and that could potentially be a good thing for Trump. But she's a newer, fresher face that people are not familiar with as much on the national stage. Even though she has been vice president, she's been standing behind Biden for the past 4 years. And I think there's this newness that we might get, a huge ratings boost. I think it's going to be fascinating to see this debate on September 10th. And depending on how Trump handles it, she's going to be a good debater. She's a former prosecutor.
Certainly will be a lot of hype leading up to that event. Now, a sign of momentum for Democrats, the Cook Political Report reclassified 3 key swing states, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, from leaning Republican to toss-ups. Cate, what are you seeing as the big takeaways at this point in presidential polling?
Well, that happened fairly quickly, that she's only been in the race for a few weeks, and we're already seeing the Cook Political Report, this nonpartisan group that figures out, where polling stands and finds these overall averages. Now, polling, this isn't just one-off. We're seeing poll after poll showing that Harris has overall, I would argue, has negated a lot of Trump's lead in a lot of battleground states. Now, some of these states where Trump had been leading and were considered lean Republican are now total toss-ups and now within the margin of error. I think overall, as I'm going to be watching out for this in the next few months, I specifically want to see how Pennsylvania will shake out, because that was, a finalist. The governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, was potentially going to be one of Harris's VP picks. It's not the direction she ended up going in. She went with the governor of Minnesota. So I'm going to be watching how, that shakes out with polling in Pennsylvania. She did make her announcement and have her first campaign appearance with Walz in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. So that's going to be, I think, a fascinating state to watch. But overall, dramatically, it's not just the Cook Political Report, moving some of these races to toss-ups. It's also Sabato's Crystal Ball, another similar group that reports on what's happening with polling that also has some of these other major states that have been moved into the toss-up category. So broadly, this is neck and neck race. And I think over the next few months, we could see it go in either direction. And I think it's just showing this momentum and this enthusiasm that Democrats are having, and maybe some independents that weren't happy with either of the tops of the ticket as of a month ago that are now recalibrating and trying to figure out where they'll fit in now that it's a different top of the ticket on the Democratic side.
One thing is for sure, Harris and her VP are constantly campaigning. Since the RNC in July, Trump has held 5 campaign rallies, while Harris will hold that many this week alone. Why is Trump largely staying off the road?
Well, so Donald Trump has never done a lot of retail politics. That was never really his thing. He hasn't always had, a big campaign burst with a lot of campaign rallies. That being said, like you mentioned, since the RNC, Trump has had 5 rallies when Harris has had 5 just this week. And we're starting to see dividends for her based on polling and based on the enthusiastic crowds. They're getting a lot of media coverage. And, from the rallies that I've watched, they have this concert-like feel. We even saw these light-up bracelets being handed out at the Trump Walz rally a few days ago. That Trump has never really had many of these rallies. That being said, he gets a lot of media attention on the ones he does have. So now that she's able to match this attention and energy and enthusiasm also in this media coverage, some of these rallies are getting, spots on cable news network where they're able to get have the full rally being shown and getting a lot of media attention. I'm going to be curious to see, does Trump recalibrate his strategy? Are we going to see him add a lot more states and a lot more campaign rallies to his schedule coming up because of this polling and because of this media blitz that we're seeing the Harris-Walz campaign do, and so far has been fairly effective?
One key issue on the campaign trail, the economy, clearly top of mind for voters. Trump has been consistent on his messaging here, and that is that the economy under Biden and Harris is a disaster. Harris is often on the defense. How has she managed to fend off Trump's attacks on this topic, Cate? And should Democrats be at all worried with any signs of weakness or cracks in the economy between now and November?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that Trump has had attacks on the economy when President Biden was the top of the ticket, and he's carried those over a bit since Harris has been on the top of the ticket. That being said, I don't think that we've really gotten to the meat of the campaign. We're still buzzing on this energy of having a new top of the ticket on one side of the ballot. And I think that so far we haven't seen the meat of these issues. We haven't really seen Harris have to defend her economic record. On September 10th, when we have this debate, that is a time when she's going to have to defend her record. And I think that some of these arguments that the Trump campaign is making about the Biden administration may be effective. That being said, we have some reporting in The Hill today that Democrats, while they are elated and excited about this new enthusiasm that's happening in the Democratic Party that had been fairly demoralized leading up to President Biden still being at the top of the ticket, that they behind the scenes are urging the Harris-Walz campaign to come up with a strong, solidified economic message to back up her campaign. That when they're done riding this momentum and this surge from the newness of her campaign, they want meat behind this. They want her to come up with a strong economic message and a strong rebuttal to when the Trump campaign comes out and says that, inflation is raging and we're seeing, a tough economy in the past few years, and compare that to the Trump administration's economy that they had. So, I think that Democrats behind the scenes are excited and want to figure out going forward, how can we propel her campaign to the next level? And let's come up with the meat behind the scenes that we can figure out for her to have a strong economic message. And I would also argue a strong message on the border, because that's another weakness and vulnerability that existed for President Biden and still exists for Vice President Harris by comparison.
Now, Harris has launched a $50 million advertising blitz this week. Kate, talk about the messaging behind the ads and what states are being targeted.
Yeah, it's so much money that is thrown into this ad blitz, and it just shows me how much money the Harris campaign has brought in and how much Democrats have in the bank. Now, this ad blitz that you're discussing is going to be focusing on Harris in the middle class. She's going to be talking about growing up in a working class family and is going to tie that in to how she can lower healthcare costs, how she can create more affordable housing, and other issues that are relevant to the middle class. And as part of this, they're going to try to draw a contrast to former President Trump, who they argue is going to just continue to give tax cuts to billionaires. This has the potential to be an effective message, considering how broad this ad will be. It's going to be airing in battleground states as well as social media. And, when you throw this type of money into an ad blitz ahead of the Democratic National Convention that's coming up, we can see some of these messages can be fairly effective. And it's something that I think that we're going to see her try to draw a major contrast between her and former President Trump in the next few months over this middle class message.
And she certainly has plenty of cash after bringing in record-breaking donations since getting into the race. Now, in a bid to undercut Harris and her running mate, Republicans, mainly J.D. Vance, are mounting attacks on Tim Walz's military record. The focus is on his decision to retire from the National Guard and a comment he made about carrying weapons in war. It's somewhat similar to the campaign to discredit Democratic presidential nominee John Kerry in 2004. Kate, will this type of tactic be as successful some 20 years later? How much is Walz's military record seen as a vulnerability for this campaign?
I actually don't think that I see Walz's military record as a type of liability on the campaign. If anything, I think it helps to it. And when Harris was vetting candidates and debating who to pick as her running mate, I think that was actually probably an asset in his military experience, that, he's been a fairly liberal governor in Minnesota, and this is something that could potentially bring in some more military voters. While Republicans have had some critiques over Tim Walz's military experience, they allege that, he retired and out of the National Guard right before a deployment in Iraq. And Senator J.D. Vance, as you mentioned, took it a step further by accusing him of dropping out right before he was being deployed. But so far, we haven't seen that message really resonate. I think it'll be, time will tell over the next few weeks whether this has an effect with, military voters or people who are concerned with this type of headline. That being said, at least two people that worked for Walz in the military came out and basically rebutted this report and said that's not true, that he had retired before this deployment announcement and have, tried to put a stop to some of these headlines. So time will tell how effective this will be. But overall, I don't really see it as much of a liability for Walz having military experience. If anything, I think that's probably an asset that could potentially bring in more voters and could probably help him bring in some independent voters on the campaign trail.
Not really on the radar right now, RFK Jr.'s presidential campaign. He's disappearing both on the trail and in the polls. Still, he did pick up a big name endorsement this week, popular podcaster and comedian Joe Rogan. Kate, are we expecting to see some renewed energy here? Where does this support from Rogan leave him?
So Joe Rogan is, a very famous podcaster, and, that does come with some clout. So that's a fairly big endorsement for him to get. It's not super surprising. He does have some overlaps, particularly on some of their opinions on vaccines, and, mistrust of specifically the COVID-19 vaccine. So it's unsurprising that Joe Rogan would endorse RFK Jr. That being said, I don't think that RFK Jr. has made, any major significant progress. In fact, earlier this week, there was a New Yorker profile of him that talked about a dead bear carcass and a bike in Central Park, and it ended up being a fairly bizarre story that overall I think brought him even further into the fringes. It was one that he tried to get ahead of and defend and talk about the story ahead of time. So, I do think that this type of endorsement can't hurt him. But that being said, Joe Rogan does come with his supporters, but at the same time, RFK Jr. is not polling very well in many states. He's, not having any major ad blitzes. He's not making major progress on the campaign trail. And, it can't hurt him. But I think we're still seeing RFK Jr. has so far just still continued to be on the fringes and hasn't done that well nationally when it comes to polling.
All right, we'll leave it there. At the Hill's Cate Martel, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And breaking news, Judge Tanya Chutkan has granted special counsel Jack Smith's request to delay proceedings in former President Trump's January 6 case. Smith previously asked to bump a swift set of deadlines following the Supreme Court's decision on granting immunity for official acts of the president. Smith's office cited that they needed more time to propose an outline on how to proceed with the prosecution after the High Court's ruling. Chutkan has postponed the hearing from next week until September 5th. Additional delays make it increasingly more likely that Trump will not stand trial until after the November election. Millions of veterans are at risk of their benefits being delayed later this year after the Department of Veterans Affairs reported a whopping $12 billion budget shortfall for 2025. The VA already asked Congress for an extra $3 billion last month to close out the fiscal year. An effort to fast-track that cash through the Congress was blocked last week. Meantime, the department is asking for an extra $12 billion in next year's budget for veterans' medical care. It cites the 2022 PACT Act as the key reason behind the shortfall. That law led to a 34% increase in benefit enrollment. If the VA doesn't receive that money by September 20th, veterans' medical benefits could be delayed in October. Lawmakers say it complicates the already heated budget talks. A federal judge is expected to decide whether Alabama can prosecute healthcare providers and advocates who help pregnant patients receive abortions elsewhere. Since the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022, abortion in Alabama has one of the strictest bans, with no exceptions for rape or incest. Using the state's criminal conspiracy law, State Attorney General Steve Marshall said he would consider prosecuting anyone that aids or abets in an abortion. Abortion advocacy groups later sued, claiming those threats limited freedom of expression and forced them to stop providing help to patients who feared prosecution. They say if the judge sides with Marshall, it could set a dangerous precedent for other states with anti-abortion laws on the books. If the plaintiffs win, providers and advocates would be able to freely provide information about out-of-state abortion options, as well as financial support without risk of prosecution. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.